I always believed that trust was unbreakable when built over years. My husband and I had that kind of trust. We had been together long enough to settle into a rhythm, the kind where love didn't need constant validation, where we knew each other's routines, moods and silences. Ours was not a marriage of grand gestures, but one of quiet companionship. It was steady, solid, until it wasn't. His friend had always been there, woven into the fabric of our lives so seamlessly that I never questioned his presence. He wasn't just an acquaintance, he was family in every sense except blood. They had been friends long before I met my husband, and when I entered the picture, I simply became part of that equation. He was at our dinner table, in our living room, in the stories my husband told. He was always around, laughing with us, helping with repairs around the house, pouring drinks on game nights. He was comfortable, trusted, safe. Or at least that's what I thought. Looking back, I wonder when the shift began. It wasn't obvious. Not something that made alarms go off in my head. It was subtle, hidden beneath layers of normalcy. Maybe it was the way his gaze lingered a little longer than necessary when he thought I wasn't looking. Or the way his compliments had a personal edge, different from the casual flattery of a friend. It wasn't what he said, but how he said it, his tone softer, his eyes sharper, his words carrying an unspoken weight. "You always know how to make a house feel like home," he had said once as I set the table for dinner. A harmless statement, one that anyone might say. But it was the way he said it, the way his eyes stayed on mine, a quiet intensity behind them, before my husband walked in and broke the moment. I ignored it. Maybe I wanted to believe I was imagining things. Maybe I told myself that a friend, a man who had been like a brother to my husband, would never see me that way. I buried those moments, dismissing them as fleeting, meaningless. But they didn't stop. He started finding small excuses to be near me. A hand on my back as he reached past me in the kitchen, a touch to my arm during a conversation, a comment here, a lingering glance there. Always subtle, always easy to overlook if I wanted to. And I did, because acknowledging it meant accepting that something was shifting, that a boundary was being tested, that his presence in our lives was no longer just friendly. There was a night when my husband fell asleep early on the couch after a long day. His friend and I sat across from each other, the dim light casting shadows on the walls. We had been talking about nothing and everything, movies, travel, childhood memories. There was nothing inappropriate about the conversation itself, but the air between us felt different, charged with something unspoken. His gaze held mine a second too long. My breath caught for just a moment before I looked away. Something had changed, but I convinced myself it was nothing, because if it was something, then I had to deal with it, and I wasn't ready for that. The evening was like any other. The house was filled with laughter, glasses clinking, casual conversations weaving in and out of the background music. My husband wasn't home, stuck at work, running late as usual. It wasn't unusual for his friends to still drop by, especially this one. He had been around for years, so much so that his presence in our home never felt intrusive. He blended into our lives seamlessly, a fixture in our world of routine and familiarity. Drinks were poured, jokes exchanged, the kind of easy, effortless energy that came with knowing someone for years. He had a charm about him, the kind that made people feel at ease. A relaxed smile, a way of making conversations feel effortless, an ability to be in any room and make it feel like he belonged there. At some point, I excused myself to the kitchen. The dishes had started piling up. and I wanted a moment of quiet before the night stretched on. The warm water ran over my fingers as I rinsed the glasses, the sound of muffled conversation continuing in the living room. My shoulders relaxed, my mind slipping into the simple rhythm of the task. I didn't hear him come in. I only became aware of his presence when I felt him behind me. The space between us had disappeared without me realizing it. A subtle shift in energy, a warmth at my back that wasn't supposed to be there. My fingers gripped the edge of the counter, my heartbeat picking up slightly, confusion settling in before anything else. Then his hand, light at first, just the faintest brush against my waist, as if it had happened by accident, but it lingered. A deliberate touch, a slow, testing pressure. I froze. The air around us thickened, the comfortable atmosphere from moments ago dissolving into something else entirely. My mind screamed at me to move, to react, to say something, but my body betrayed me, locked in place, caught between disbelief and the terrifying awareness that this was happening. His breath was close, too close. I was wondering when we'd finally get a moment alone. He murmured, his voice so low, so casual, as if this was normal, as if this wasn't a line neither of us were supposed to cross. The words sent a sharp electric jolt through my body. Not from excitement, not from interest, from pure panic. This was wrong. I opened my mouth to speak, to push him away, to do anything other than stand there in the suffocating tension. But before I could, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. The weight of his hand disappeared instantly. He stepped back just in time. And when my husband walked in, he was standing at the other end of the kitchen, his expression unreadable, as if nothing had happened. The moment replayed in my mind like a broken record over and over, each time more suffocating than the last. The warmth of his hand, the way his fingers had pressed just enough to make his intentions clear. The low whisper that had sent ice through my veins. I hadn't told anyone, not even my husband. And yet it was all I could think about. I kept telling myself that it had been a mistake, that maybe I had imagined it, that maybe he had just been too close by accident. But then I would remember the way he stepped back the second my husband entered the room, how his voice had been too deliberate, how my body had known before my mind did that something was very, very wrong. I avoided him after that night. I made excuses not to be around when he came over. I lingered in the bedroom, suddenly finding reasons to fold laundry, rearrange my dresser, anything to avoid stepping into the same space as him, but he didn't avoid me. At first, it was subtle, a lingering look across the room when my husband wasn't paying attention. A smirk just barely there before he turned away. Then the little comments started. "You seem different these days," he said one night when my husband left the room to take a call. I didn't answer. I kept my eyes on the TV, my fingers clenched together, pretending not to hear him. He leaned in slightly, his voice just low enough to make my skin crawl. "You don't have to pretend, you know." A shiver ran down my spine. I stood up too fast, almost knocking over my glass, muttering something about needing water before rushing to the kitchen. My hands shook as I gripped the counter, trying to steady my breath. This wasn't happening. Except it was. And the worst part? My husband didn't seem to notice. He still laughed with him, still invited him over like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Had he seen the way his friend looked at me? Had he noticed how I barely spoke, how I found excuses to leave the room? Or was he choosing not to see it? One evening, as I cleared the dishes, my husband stood behind me, his voice casual. "You've been acting strange lately." My fingers stiffened around the plate. "I'm fine.
I said too quickly. He didn't push, but the weight of his gaze lingered, and I wondered, for the first time, did he already know? The kitchen was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. The air was thick, heavy, pressing against my skin. The dishes were done, the lights dimmed, and the house felt too still, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I wasn't expecting him to come in. I wasn't expecting to be alone with him again. But then, there he was. His presence filled the space before I even turned around. I felt him before I saw him. The quiet steps, the shift in the air, the way the tiny hairs on the back of my neck stood up in warning. My fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. "I was starting to think you were avoiding me," he said, his voice smooth, calculated. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. My throat felt dry, my heart drumming too fast. "I've just been busy," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. A soft chuckle, a slow, measured step closer. "You don't have to be nervous around me," he murmured, his tone carrying something unsettling. I turned then, finally forcing myself to meet his eyes. His expression was calm, but there was something beneath it. Something smug, something confident. He knew I hadn't told my husband, and that realization made my stomach churn. I took a step back, but he moved with me, keeping the space between us unbearably close. The counter pressed against my back, my pulse pounded in my ears. His fingers reached up, barely grazing my arm, feather-light, testing. I flinched, my body stiffening. "Don't." He tilted his head slightly, as if amused by my reaction. "You act like this is a surprise." My skin turned cold. "What does that mean?" His smirk deepened. "Come on, you felt it too. That night in the kitchen, you didn't pull away, you let it happen." A sharp, icy wave of fear and anger crashed through me. I froze. I snapped. "I didn't—" His hand brushed my waist. A deliberate, unhurried touch. "And you're freezing now?" Something inside me snapped. I shoved him hard. He stumbled back, eyes widening in shock, his smirk vanishing. My breathing was ragged, my hands shaking. "What the hell is wrong with you?" My voice cracked, raw and furious. His expression shifted, annoyance flickering across his face, as if I had broken the rules of a game I hadn't even agreed to play. "Relax," he said, his voice quieter now, laced with something colder. "I was just seeing where we stood." My stomach turned. "Where we stood," he scoffed, running a hand through his hair. "You've been looking at me differently for a while now. Don't act like this is one-sided." Disgust, rage, fear, it all collided at once, making my hands tremble. "You're delusional," I whispered. A flicker of something darker crossed his face. "Am I?" Footsteps, a shadow at the doorway. My body jerked in terror before I even turned to look, and there he was, my husband. His eyes locked onto me first, taking in my pale face, my wide eyes, the way my chest rose and fell too fast. Then slowly his gaze shifted to his friend. The silence that followed was unbearable. Then, his voice, calm, too calm. "What's going on?" The tension in the room became suffocating. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't form the words that should have come easily. His friend was the first to speak. "We were just talking," he said smoothly, his voice too casual. "She seemed upset, so I was checking in." A lie, so effortless, so easy. My stomach clenched. My husband's eyes flickered between us, studying every detail, searching for something unspoken. I swallowed the fear in my throat. "That's not—" His friend let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "You've been distant, man. She's been acting strange. I was just trying to figure out what was wrong." His words twisted in the air like poison, infecting everything.
My husband's jaw tightened. I could see the hesitation, the struggle in his eyes, the battle between trust and doubt. The moment stretched too long. Then finally, he turned to me. "Is that true?" The question hit like a slap. Shock spread through my chest. "Are you serious?" My voice cracked. His eyes searched mine. "I just need to understand what's happening here." A sickening knot formed in my stomach. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't accusing. He was trying to make sense of it. And that broke me more than anything, because for the first time I saw it, the flicker of doubt, the crack in his certainty. My breath shuddered. I didn't do anything. Silence. Then his friend exhaled, shaking his head like this was all too exhausting. I should go. He started to move toward the door, but I wasn't done. "You think you can just walk away?" My voice was sharper now, filled with the fury I had been swallowing for too long. His friend glanced back at me, his expression unreadable. "What do you want me to say?" My throat burned. "The truth." A slow smirk. "The truth is subjective, isn't it?" Then he was gone. The door shut behind him, leaving only silence in his wake. My heart pounded against my ribs as I turned to my husband. He was staring at the floor, his fists clenched, his shoulders tense. I needed him to say something, anything, but when he looked at me, the hurt in his eyes was worse than anything I had imagined. "Did you ever think," he said slowly, "that maybe I should have heard it from you first?" The words hit harder than a slap. Tears burned my eyes. I didn't know how. His exhale was shaky, his hands running over his face. "How long has this been going on?" I shook my head. Nothing happened. "I swear to you, nothing happened." His gaze pinned me in place, but it almost did. My lips parted, but I had nothing to say. Because he was right. The air between us felt heavier than ever, the weight of what had happened pressing down like something we might never recover from. I took a step forward. "I didn't betray you." His jaw tensed. "But you didn't stop it soon enough either, did you?" The truth of his words cut through me. I had waited too long. And now the damage was already done. The air between them felt heavier than it ever had. The weight of the words unspoken, the trust that had cracked, the doubt that had taken root where certainty once lived. He sat across from her at the dining table, his fingers loosely clasped together, his jaw tight. He had been silent for what felt like an eternity. She wanted him to say something, anything. Every second that passed felt like another nail sealing them into a reality she didn't know how to escape. She could feel her pulse in her throat, the rapid beats of her heart reminding her that she was still here, still breathing, still waiting for a verdict she wasn't sure she could bear. "You should have told me," he finally said, his voice quieter than she expected. She swallowed hard. "I didn't know how." His gaze lifted to hers, unreadable. "You didn't know how, or you didn't want to?" Her hands curled into fists in her lap. "That's not fair." His laugh was bitter. Humorless. "No, you know what's not fair? Finding out my best friend has been testing the limits of my marriage while my wife—" He stopped himself, shaking his head, exhaling sharply. "While my wife was too scared to say anything." Her throat tightened. I wasn't scared. He leaned forward, his eyes dark. "Then what were you?" She hesitated. The truth sat heavy in her chest, and for a second she considered saying what she knew he needed to hear. That she had been afraid of ruining everything, that she hadn't wanted to create a rift between him and his friend, that she hadn't known if he would believe her. But none of that was the real reason. The real reason was that a small, ugly part of her had ignored it, had brushed off the signs, had told herself it wasn't real because dealing with it meant admitting she had let it get this far. She dropped her gaze. I don't know. He sat back, running a hand over his face. Yeah, that's the problem. Silence stretched between them again. The echoes of the past few weeks filled the room, the stolen glances, the touches she had dismissed, the moments she had chosen not to see for what they were. She wanted to tell him that she never once wanted it, that she had never felt anything for his friend except discomfort, that she had never imagined herself at the center of this mess. But would it matter? Would any of it change the fact that she had let it go too far before she did something about it? He sighed, rubbing his hands together. I don't know how to move forward from this. Her chest ached. Then tell me what you need me to do. He met her gaze, and for the first time she saw it. The exhaustion, the pain, the part of him that didn't just feel betrayed by his friend, but by her too. I don't know if there's anything to do, he admitted. Fear gripped her ribcage. You don't mean that. I don't know what I mean, he muttered. I just know that nothing feels the same. She wanted to reach for his hand, to close the distance between them, to fix this. But how do you fix something when you're not even sure how it broke? She could have stopped it earlier. That was the truth. She could have told him the first time his friend looked at her too long, the first time his fingers lingered, the first time he stood too close. Would it have changed anything? Would he have believed her then? Would they still be sitting here staring at each other like strangers? She shook her head, clearing the thoughts. I love you. A long pause, then he exhaled. I know. She waited for him to say it back. He didn't. The silence after that was the loudest thing she had ever heard.